This is a Squiz podcast. We're your shortcut to being informed. It's Media Literacy Week, so we're taking the opportunity to release Newshounds 2.0. Newshounds, made by us, is a media literacy program for teachers of primary-age kids to teach their class how to spot misinformation when they come across it online. At the Squiz, we really think being able to tell fact from fiction, particularly online, is important for us as individuals, but for society more broadly. So if you're a teacher or you know a teacher, head to squizkids.com.au and sign up for Newshounds. It's completely free and the new version is designed to make it really, really easy for you. When it comes to skincare, you shouldn't have to choose between the stuff that works and what you can afford. That's why we've partnered with Go-To. There's no baffling science, no fluff with Australia's go-to for skincare. Just seriously effective products that make your skin and wallet happy. Level up your routine at gotoskincare.com.
G'day, I'm Kate Watson. The Bondi stabbings, the Wakeley church stabbing, the result of the Voice referendum, the war in the Middle East. Just a handful of examples of news stories which have become conversations about more than the issue itself, but rather about the information we, the public, are privy to, and whether that information is harmful, hurtful, inaccurate, or persuasive, and the intention behind it. I'm talking about mis and disinformation, and the increasingly prevalent concern about our ability to decipher information online, what harm it might be doing to us, to our kids, and to society. Associate Professor Tanya Notley is our interviewee today. Her research focuses on media literacy. Full transparency, we came across her as part of our effort to do our bit to ensure a media literate Australia through our Newshounds program for primary-aged kids. Today, she talks to me about the problem, the complication in trying to solve for it, her frustration that we can't move more quickly, and at the end, what she thinks is at stake here. Tanya, let's start by explaining what media literacy is and why you're so committed to it.
It's about media representations at its heart. It's concerned with getting people to think very reflexively about how people, places, ideas are being represented in the media, both in the media that they're consuming, but also that they're creating. And it's about getting people to think about what fair representation is, and also about supporting diverse media inclusion, supporting people to make informed decisions about their media use. So, it took a long while for me to move to research, but that passion certainly led me into my first jobs, which was working in community media and human rights media in a number of different countries, and eventually, led to me becoming a researcher in that field.
You mentioned to me offline before we started chatting that one of the reasons you became so interested in journalism and media literacy goes way back to when you were a kid at school and how much you enjoyed BTN, Behind the News. I guess the big thing that's changed since you were at school and since you were a kid is the advent of social media. Social media is a big part of this conversation. Before we get into that, I think we should clarify a couple of other buzzwords, which are mis and disinformation. Just explain the difference between those two things, because I think we just talk about them like everyone knows what we mean, but they're quite different.
Yeah, so misinformation is false or misleading information that might have been created by a mistake, and that happens. People sometimes get it wrong, including news organisations, and hopefully they'll own up to those things. And then disinformation is when it's very deliberate. It's an act to deliberately mislead people. So false information created deliberately to mislead people. And that can happen because people want power, influence. They want them to buy products. States want to disrupt democracy, divide populations. So what we're seeing is a real rise in these disinformation actors, entire companies, entire armies of people whose job it is to fool us, to mislead us. And social media has certainly been an enabler of that.
Where are we starting from as we have this conversation? Are we in Australia fairly media literate and fairly able to understand mis and disinformation? Where would you say we are on sort of the scale compared to other countries, or even just compared to where you'd like us to be?
We haven't released it yet, but we've just tested 2,000 adults' ability to identify misinformation, to make judgments about information online. And it's pretty bad. Even when people are trying and they're spending the time, they just don't have the skills and the knowledge. And that shouldn't be a surprise. We haven't put any investments in media literacy in Australia at a national level. We don't have any national ongoing funding or support for adult media literacy. And for children, it's ad hoc. So some children are getting it. It seems like most are not, certainly not regularly. So we shouldn't really be surprised that we're in a pretty bad state, and it's something that we need to change.
We surveyed our audience, our Squiz audience, our adult audience recently. Most of them said, and the vast majority said they felt confident that they could identify mis and disinformation. Certainly not here to tell them they're wrong, but it is interesting to plant that seed with them that what you're finding is people are more confident in their ability to do that than what you're actually finding when you then test that. Is that right?
That's exactly right. And in fact, we were just talking about the results yesterday. It's interesting that the people that did best actually didn't inflate their confidence. They always sort of, I'm only a little confident. So I think that we all need to recognise that it is really challenging, and all of us are vulnerable. And so it's a sort of commitment that's needed from all of us that we will be updating our skills and knowledge, because part of it's understanding things like how the business models work, why people are spreading disinformation, and understanding what we know about the motivations and who are super spreaders of disinformation. You know, part of it's about that kind of knowledge. So we all have to kind of be committed to that. But then fact-checking skills are changing as well. We were surprised how few people, very, very few people, were able to do a reverse image search, which is a very easy thing to do. But, you know, people haven't been shown that, and it's not, you know, in our education systems.
One of the questions I will ask you, just to have a think on it a little bit later, is like, what is the greatest... What scares you the most, particularly about this disinformation? And people are even talking about disinformation wars, and I will get into that. But let's step it back to your point, particularly if social media and the social media companies are a large part of this problem, or at least the way we're getting information from social media is a large part of this problem. I think people have wrapped their head around the algorithm. I think people understand that they're being served stuff that they're interested in, and if they seem to appreciate a certain opinion, they'll get served more of that. But what are the other ingredients that go into what people are fed online?
I think, you know, what worries me is that if we don't have transparency about how things are working and what's being done on social media platforms, there's a limit to media literacy. We already know we don't have media literacy, but there's a limit because we actually have to have some control over the algorithm, and we deserve that and we should be getting that. And legislation can enforce that and give us back some control. But we've been very slow to move. We've had inquiry after inquiry and very slow to move on appropriate legislation to just give back some transparency, because, in fact, one of the problems is, you know, when we talk about harms in social media or risks in social media is the social media platforms have cut off researchers increasingly over the years. So we can't look under the hood and we can't see what's happening. So researchers have been calling for, you know, access to really understand what's happening in terms of disinformation spreading so that we're able to respond to it. And that hasn't been forthcoming. And so we've seen EU regulators really move forward with this, with regulation to enforce it, saying, no, we need to know. We can't trust the platforms to be having such influence on such, you know, large proportion of society and not be ensuring that we have people looking at these, what are ultimately public spaces, and so that we can make informed decisions. Because if we can't make informed decisions, we rush to policy, which doesn't make sense, and that is a risk at the moment. So I think that's a real worry, that we just aren't given the transparency. We can't make evidence-based decisions if we don't know what's going on. We have to know what's going on.
What have they, and so the answer, I guess, that I'm hearing from you is that we don't really know what the ingredients are. We can't really tell what we're being served and why. And we will talk about some of the steps that have been taken to address this. But I can't help but wonder if you have a view on what platforms are the worst. Like, which ones are you most concerned about? If we talk a lot about, obviously, Meta. We talk about TikTok. We even talk about, platforms that aren't social media platforms like Google, but they're big tech giants. Is there one that you would pull out?
Well, obviously X, Twitter, is just a toxic cesspit now, and I'm shocked that people still use it when they're opposed to that. But that's my personal view.
And explain to people, why is that obvious?
Well, they eliminated all of their human rights monitoring staff and removed policies around the removal of hateful content. And so we've just seen content which abhorrently encourages and supports hate and violence. And so, we're just not seeing the kind of monitoring and takedowns that, really is the very basic requirement. And I think that's just horrendous and makes it a very unsafe place. And I think ultimately we should be able to expect that these places are safe and that they don't foster hate and violence. I think that those are reasonable expectations. So I think, in terms of transparency, it's really hard to say. And so, we do have this voluntary code for mis and disinformation in Australia. And I think Australia was one of the first countries to implement that. And that means it's self-regulation with some oversight from ACMA, which is the Australian Communication Media Authority. And they just released yesterday their latest report where they're looking at, is this good enough? Is this working? And so what was clear to me is, there's really not the kind of transparency we need when it comes to what content is being taken down because it violates policies and what the topics were. The platforms are reporting this in different ways, or they're not really providing the information, so you can't really compare them. So, it makes it impossible to make a real assessment of that, of what's going on and what they're doing. So what we need is sort of standards and expectations in place, and my feeling is that is what ACMA is calling for, where they have to provide specific types of information so we can compare them, because that's actually really important.
I'm glad you brought up ACMA and that voluntary code, because it relates to what our government is looking to do to address some of this. We'll chat about that in just a moment.
If you're after skincare that works but without the sticker shock, we're right there with you. That's why we're stoked to have Go2 Skincare as a podcast partner on News Club. With Go2, you get all the good stuff. We're talking potent, effective ingredients without the hefty price tag. No compromises, just happy skin. Level up your routine at go2skincare.com.
So, Tanya, the government has tabled legislation around mis and disinformation. They want to pass that bill this year. Broadly, what it does is make that voluntary code you spoke about before mandatory, and it gives ACMA, the Australian Communications and Media Authority, the power to demand answers from platforms as to whether they're sticking to the code. What has come from this is a very public conversation about free speech. A lot of people who oppose the legislation would argue this is going to give far too much power to someone like ACMA to determine what is and isn't misinformation, what's disinformation. For your part, how do you come at the free speech question? Where's the line?
It is a really important issue. I hope it's not politicised and people are really given the facts on this and are able to kind of make assessments based on the facts. And with the proposed mis and disinformation bill, ACMA has no takedown powers. So just with broadcast media, they can't enforce takedowns. And I think that the proposed bill is very clear about that. What it is about is requiring processes from the social media platforms. So they are required to have transparency around a range of issues like what they're doing to monitor and identify content that's being flagged as being harmful, disinformation, what they're doing, what kind of reporting systems they have in place, what media literacy initiatives they're kind of rolling out to help people understand what they can do if they see mis and disinformation, all of those kinds of things. So it's really about monitoring the processes and then having enough information so that ACMA can determine if those processes are effective in reducing misinformation and disinformation. But it's also, I think, some of the controversy will be around this idea of harmful mis and disinformation. So they do define that in the bill. It's not just things we don't agree with. It's where there's harm could be caused around things like elections and health and public emergencies. So, yeah, I think it's important for there to be kind of clear communication to the public so that they understand what is being proposed. Otherwise, we're going to see this really politicised and become a debate where people think it's going to be the government taking down things they don't like.
Yeah, and I think, look, we're not here to make a judgment on that. I think it's an incredibly difficult topic. But what I see when I look at the way this is discussed in the news is that, and I'll give you an example. So we've just had the anniversary of the failed Voice referendum. Many of the proponents of the Voice blame mis and disinformation for the failing of that vote. As I said, we aren't here to, make a call on whether that was the case or not, of course. But I do see it being used as a political sort of tool, that the reason something didn't happen is because of misinformation, or the reason this didn't happen is because of disinformation. I mean, you just have to look at the way Donald Trump talks about fake news in the US and then galvanizes an audience towards it. It seems to be being used politically, these phrases used politically. And do you agree? And what's your view on that? It probably concerns you.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that it is the reality that people will have different perspectives on what is mis and disinformation. And so I think that's why we need to be really clear about the boundaries and parameters of this idea of what's harmful. I think that's where it gets really complicated. We do have existing laws around hate speech that, where people threaten or incite violence. We do have all of these laws that are here to protect us offline, and they apply online. And what we're often seeing is that police are under-equipped to enforce the law in online spaces. I mean, what happens online is in real world, and we need the law to apply there as well. And so, that's a real challenge. A lot of issues could be addressed if the police were better equipped to be dealing with all of these crimes online. And we're hearing again and again that that's not the case, that people go with evidence to police station and crimes are not investigated in a timely way. So, and I guess where it gets more trickier, where a crime hasn't been committed, but certainly, this is veering on being very harmful to a group in society. And, I guess what gets really complicated is that before an election, before, the Voice referendum, that's when we see mis and disinformation peak in a really timely, in a particular time frame. And that's very complicated. And there's no doubt that people were swayed by mis and disinformation, where that veered into a territory that it was hateful, where it was defamation, where, the law should have applied, is another question, but it's very difficult to have a timely response when it's the day or 2 days before the vote. So, look, I do think it is really tricky, but first and foremost, we need to know that the law is being applied to these online environments and know that social media spaces are safe environments for people. So I think that would be a good start.
And I guess to your earlier point, most people want to know that what they're seeing is true and understand that they can understand that. So the education piece is really what you would fall back on, I guess. It's like, well, this problem goes away to a certain extent if we can actually identify incorrect information.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we need both regulation to ensure that we have the transparency to make informed and evidence-informed decisions about these environments, these media environments online. But absolutely, while that's happening, and it's been years and years and years, you know, the Digital Platforms Inquiry started in 2019, I think. The report made all of these recommendations, and still we haven't seen progress there in terms of regulation. So it takes years and years for the regulation. So we need to immediately move with the education. I don't think it's sufficient on its own to be educating people, because people shouldn't be responsible for protecting themselves online from this micro-targeting of disinformation that's happening. But, you know, it's one thing that we've all got, and increasing our media literacy does help us and can protect us to a degree. So it's something that we all need to get moving on at the same time while appropriate regulation is worked out, which is obviously what's happened, you know, what's happening at the moment. But where that will go, none of us know.
I'm hearing, and I could be wrong, but I'm hearing from you, someone very passionate about this, someone who's been engaging on this for a really long time, but a frustration that we're not able to do this more quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think it should be that difficult. And I guess I do look at policy where there's been policies for better support for children in schools in other countries or for low-income homes. And they've been there for a decade or more. And yeah, it does feel frustrating that we are where we are. And, you know, it seems like there's the will, but it seemed like that years ago too, and yet we haven't progressed. So it can be very frustrating to be hearing from all the actors working in this space, from hearing from the policymakers that they recognise the needs, that they understand the possibilities, and yet we're just not having the movement that we need.
And as you say, it often takes a lot longer than you would like. We at The Squiz, of course, argue that this is all well and good, regulations are well and good, social media bans are all well and good, but educating children before they even get online and get these apps and get these get on these social media platforms is super, super important. And as I said, that's what Newshounds, our media literacy program, aims to address. Tanya, what scares you the most about and I guess an illiterate Australia when it comes to media literacy and the spread of mis and disinformation? If you had to say what the most frightening outcome of not addressing this is, what is it?
Well, the issue is that our democracy is founded on the idea that we can make informed decisions. And if we can't make informed decisions, then our democracy is really at risk. And that's the risk here, is that disinformation runs rampant. It's very highly targeted to people, the kinds of messages, the timing, all these things. And there's no controls over that. And so we're all just completely vulnerable. And therefore we can't make informed decisions, and we make poor decisions about our health, about who to vote for, about our education, about, you know, all these things that are really, really important. And so that's the ultimate risk here. And as I said, we don't just need media literacy, we need the right regulation, but we certainly need a multi-pronged approach, and media literacy has to be a part of that.
Where do you think we're doing well?
I'm hopeful about Australian citizens and that we agree on this, because people say in our surveys they are trying hard. They do want to know where and how to identify good quality news and information. They do want to be able to get support to address mis and disinformation. They do want the platforms to make this better. So we're really quite in agreement about this, and the challenge is getting it right and making it happen. And that's where we need a whole lot of different actors involved, including government. But I'd be really worried if we didn't care, feel that way. It's a good foundation. And, you know, we have, back in 2021, when we first did our adult media literacy survey, we asked people, do you think all children should be receiving media literacy in schools. And, more than 4 in 5 adults said, yes, that should be happening. This time, when we did the survey this year, we asked that same question. The result was the same, but we also asked them, should all adults have access to media literacy education? And it was almost exactly the same. 4 in 5 adults say yes. So there's a real interest in this. People want access to media literacy education. They say they're interested. They've told us the topics they're interested in. We really just need to move forward with providing that kind of support.
Tanya, thank you so much for joining us. If there's particularly people listening, if there's interest in Tanya's work, I'll make sure I include a link in your episode notes, because you've done extensive work on this topic. And clearly at the Squiz, we agree that this is something that we're really, really pleased people care for, and hence why we're talking to you this week. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Kate.
As I said, a link to some of Tanya's work is in your episode notes. Thanks for listening. And if it's a conversation that interests you, you might want to go to squizkids.com.au and share Newshounds with someone you know. They might not be a teacher, but they might know one. Newshounds is currently being completed by 3,400 classrooms. We want that to be every classroom. Next week, I interview Will Glasgow, the first and only Australian journalist allowed back in China since September 2020. Chat then.